Hello and welcome to 4 Metrics to Boost Kubernetes Data Resiliency. Today's webinar is sponsored by Trilio and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be as informative event as possible for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement problems, but if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll work with you to get you up to speed on the presentation. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. There's an application resiliency ebook from Trilio. There's also a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club where you can get access to Actual Tech Media's great printed resources on technology topics, and a link to the ATM Event Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Also, Trilio will be providing some resources via QR code later, so have your mobile phone ready to capture those. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker today, Ben Morrison. He's a solutions architect at Trilio. He's always a joy to have on presentations with us here. Ben, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, Scott. Thank you for having me.
Well, take it away. I'm looking forward to this.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you to Actual Tech Media for having Trilio on here again. It's always a pleasure doing webinars with you guys. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're going to be talking about the 4 metrics that can help you boost your cloud native application resiliency. Now this, there'll be no demo today. This is going to be just going through slides and discussion, but of course I don't only want to be talking at you the entire time. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A or go ahead and tell your own stories or answer some of my questions I might have for you through that Q&A. As we go throughout the presentation here. I'll also note that this presentation is a bit of a preview to an ebook that we have coming out later on this quarter. And so as Scott mentioned, there'll be some QR codes at the very end, and one of those will be to sign up to receive that ebook as soon as it is released. So today what we're going to be covering in our agenda is, first off, what is data resiliency and why it matters at its core, and kind of look into what you might be doing in terms of data resiliency right now in your environments. We'll go into those 4 metrics that we believe need to be the metrics that you monitor and keep an eye on and improve in order to make sure you're boosting your data resiliency. And then lastly, of course, we'll talk about why you need cloud native protection to assist with these 4 metrics and to assist with your data resiliency. So really showing there how on the modern Kubernetes environments, how cloud native data protection can really make a huge difference, especially relating to these 4 metrics. So to get started here, we'll start off with a quote from IDC's latest 2022 predictions. IDC has always been a historically very great source for predictions in the tech world, especially when it comes to the landscape of Kubernetes. And so as you can see here, what they're describing and predicting is essentially an exponential growth in the use of production grade Kubernetes clusters and new cloud native apps. And so, of course, with that exponential growth that we're expected to see over the next 2 more years here, there's going to be some challenges that do come along the way. Of course, everyone wants to be moving to Kubernetes because it has so many benefits and it is such an easy platform to be able to build your business applications, your environments onto. But with any change in technology, there's always going to be some challenges along the way that we need to make sure we look into. And so the first one here, and I would say is probably the most commonly discussed, would be that infrastructure resiliency. There's a lot of advantages to Kubernetes in terms of that eventual consistency and having a high availability with multiple nodes, but of course that is still not perfect. And so in the event that that a cluster has some sort of infrastructure issues and possibly an environment goes down, you need to make sure that your applications and your data on those clusters are in fact going to be resilient and be able to be brought back up easily and restored. For application migration complexity, as we all know, there's a lot of different players out there when it comes to cloud as well as Kubernetes specific distributions. And some of these players want to put up roadblocks essentially with preventing you from migrating to one or the other. At the same time, there's a lot of Kubernetes users out there that want a multi-cloud environment. They see a lot of advantages of using multiple clouds and multiple distributions. And so, of course, with that, application migration becomes a little more complex, and you want to make sure that you are able to migrate your applications and data from one cluster to the next in the event that you ever might need to, whether it's just your day-to-day operations or if it's a disaster recovery situation. With governance and compliance, of course, as you're doing all this, you want to make sure that you are in compliance, whether that's in internal compliance, in industry related compliance, or maybe in actual government compliance that you need to be following, such as GDPR, for example. When it comes to backing up data, you need to make sure that you're keeping that data, especially if it's customer external data, keeping it for an appropriate amount of time, but also need to make sure that you do not have it for too long. That's when you get into GDPR, you cannot hold on to data for a certain amount of time. And so you need to make sure that you're following that governance and compliance. And we'll talk to you about how some of those cloud native solutions out there have features in place to help you follow these. For SLAs, of course, this is always going to be a challenge and an important topic in any technical conversation, making sure that you meet those SLAs to make sure your customers and internal customers and partners as well are all happy. The main SLA that we'll be talking about today is RTO. And of course, I'm sure many of you know about RTO here already, but we'll get into that as well. And then lastly, ransomware protection and recoverability. In the talk today, we'll be talking mostly about the recoverability portion of that ransomware in terms of if your cluster, if your application on the cloud ends up being victim to a ransomware attack, what you can do in terms of backup and recovery to make sure that your backups are protected themselves and to have the confidence that you can restore those backups to have your applications up and running as soon as possible. So here with the infrastructure resiliency, as I mentioned, establishing protocols, making those disaster recovery plans is really what this is going to get into, making sure you have essentially, if you can, a one-click operation to immediately restore in case you need to. Here in terms of migration, making sure essentially that you have agnostic migration, that you're able to move from one cloud to the next or one distribution to the next without having to face any of those roadblocks. For that governance and compliance, having detailed and repeatable DR plans is really what I think is core here in terms of making sure you're in compliance. Once you set up a disaster recovery plan, you want to make sure that it is easily repeated so you don't have any situations falling through the cracks and becoming outside of compliance. For those SLAs, as I mentioned, hitting your RTO or even lowering your objective RTO is very crucial here. And then lastly, with that ransomware, having the ability to bounce back, having the confidence that you have immutable or encrypted backups that you can then restore to get back all of your data exactly as it was before it was corrupted. So what are some of the different looks at how to protect data in terms of the cloud native Kubernetes world that we're in now? So there's, of course, the cloud native piece that we're going to be talking about later on, but here, these three are some alternatives that we tend to see in the market, some of which are good ways to start, some of which are a little outdated, and we'll get into some of that detail. For snapshots specifically, this is a common way that we sometimes see organizations or teams going about backing up their applications and data, and that's by simply taking a snapshot through their storage vendor and then storing that snapshot someplace else. Well, unfortunately, the snapshot alone is not the entire entire picture. There's more pieces to the puzzle that need to be put in. Oftentimes, what happens here with going just strictly this storage snapshots route is it ends up taking a lot of time. It becomes very expensive and takes a lot of different individual workers to be able to get those snapshots stitched together. There can be times where if it's not properly tested often enough, then maybe the system can become outdated, and recovering those snapshots can be a lot more difficult. And so it can get very, very complex. And you can also have vendor lock-in when it comes to these snapshots as well. You're essentially relying only on your storage vendor for those snapshots. And so if the day ever comes that you want to switch, you could be out of luck when it comes to having accessibility to those snapshots themselves. So not a bad way to start, but what we tend to see is as organizations grow, this snapshots only approach becomes very complex and very, very expensive. When it comes to legacy data protection, some of those data protection technologies where they essentially back up an entire VM. These work for organizations in terms of a backup solution. However, again, they get very, very expensive. They normally require agents, which gets costly in terms of higher resource usage, and they're not very granular. When you back up an entire VM using a legacy data protection technology, you're backing up everything in that VM, and that might not be necessary. Maybe you only want to back up a few components of an application, or only your applications and not the infrastructure itself. Because of the nature of Kubernetes today, it's so easy to spin up a new cluster if needed. So why back up an entire VM when you could save money on storage and resources by only backing up your applications and then bringing them onto a new cluster when the time is needed? And then lastly, here, open source backup and recovery tools. Valero is the main one out there that is commonly used for that open source backup and recovery. Again, similar to snapshots, it's an okay place to start, but we have seen, talking to a lot of organizations in the market out there, how it doesn't scale necessarily well. As you begin to grow, there's no user interface, there's no customer support for any of these open source technologies, and they're really very, very bare bones. And so if you're willing to put in the time and effort and money into building around it, you could be happy with an open source solution. But oftentimes, as organizations grow, it's just they tend to be lacking a lot of the benefits that you need. Security as well. Oftentimes, these open source solutions have very limited security features as well. And so here is that broken link then from everything we just talked about, especially pertaining towards traditional data protection and then the new cloud native applications. With especially that traditional piece, you have dependence on the operating system itself. You can have your backups become very siloed in terms of only being able to back up those monolithic applications and not transferring it easily to those more modular microservice applications with constantly changing services. These traditional data protections are rarely changing, rarely updated, so you're not at the cutting edge of technology when it comes to that backup and restore. And they're normally only focused on the storage of the data volumes themselves. And we'll see here that the metadata as well is very, very important when it comes to cloud native backups. Because of these modular microservice infrastructures with Kubernetes clustered applications, you need to make sure you're restoring that metadata as well so that the application can be up and running exactly as it was before. So from here, we'll go ahead and do a poll. Now that we've talked a bit about those 4 different options out there, you have the snapshots only, traditional data protection of backing up entire VMs that your clusters are running on. You have the open source tools such as Valero, and then finally, cloud native data protection. So which ones are the ones out there that people tend to be using? Let's see. Okay, we still got some answers coming in. Go ahead and get those answers submitted. So we still have a few more coming in here. Glad to have the good participation. Thanks everyone for that. I saw some people saying they're from South Carolina over there. I'm glad we have people from all over the country, probably over the world. Let us know where you're coming in from, calling in from. I've never been to South Carolina personally, but I have been to North Carolina, and that was beautiful. And I've heard South is just a little warmer, right? So seems like a good spot. Okay, I think we're about done here. It looks like we've stopped having entries, and so we can go ahead and hit next. Hopefully everyone can see here the results on the screen. And so this is pretty much what I expected. I'm actually pleasantly surprised with how many cloud native data protection tools we have being used out there with this audience. 1/4 of the audience is using cloud native protection, which is excellent to hear. Also, the traditional data protection being the highest, I'm not at all surprised in as well. Organizations have been using this traditional VM backup protection for a while, and so it obviously makes sense that if you move to a new infrastructure, Kubernetes, that you are going to continue to use some of the tools that you used before. But hopefully by the end of this conversation today, you'll start to see the benefits of moving towards that bottom category, that cloud native protection category, mostly in terms of that cost savings and performance benefits that you'll see. Okay, so metric number 1 that we're going to be going into, RTO, recovery time objective. I'm sure many people already know what this is, and this is obviously going to be a very important metric that we're talking about today in terms of achieving your RTO goal, and even maybe having the power and performance to lower your RTO goal to even have lower downtime in the event of some sort of outage. The benefits, obviously, of having a faster RTO is your customer base is going to experience limited downtime and going to have the best possible experience. Obviously, as we all know, downtime can be very detrimental to customers and reoccurring customers as well. It can oftentimes contribute to customer attrition if there is an event, even could just be one event where customers experience a significant amount of downtime, especially when you think about industries like finance and banking sector where time is very, very important. And so you don't want to make sure you fall into that category of having some sort of extended downtime and having frustration amongst your customers. Even outside of your customers, there's your reputation, of course, which contributes to getting new customers, getting new revenue. But essentially, in the world we live in today, we all see the news articles of large organizations or companies that become a victim of maybe a ransomware attack or even just have some sort of downtime. Whenever these things occur, everyone's talking about them, and then the reputation of that company does dwindle if there's a large negative event when it comes to some sort of outage. So you need to make sure that you increase that trust in your brand itself to continue having net new customers coming in. And then of course, here your revenue as well. I like the idea of having your customers plus your reputation equals revenue. I think would be good here as well, because that's essentially what it is, right? When it comes to the bottom line, you want to make sure that you have your customers happy. If your customers are happy, they're going to keep coming back to you, and you're going to be building that revenue itself. So really just getting the most ROI out of your backup and recovery solution, because having that minimal downtime will ultimately lead to more revenue. Some of the downsides of those legacy backup solutions: manual processes, having to stitch together snapshots. This especially pertains to those who are only using snapshots. I am curious, and I encourage you to test those recovery systems more often. I'm actually curious if anyone wants to comment in the question section about maybe how often they test their snapshot only systems, because that is very, very important with these. Sometimes stitching those and the manual processes that come with them can be very, very time consuming. And so switching to an enterprise grade tool can make a huge difference. Increased effort due to constantly changing cloud native landscapes. This is really getting towards scalability. When it comes to those constant upgrades and new applications, you want to make sure that your solution's agile enough to immediately capture any of that new data or new applications coming into your cluster itself. And so normally traditional data protection solutions can be a little bit lacking here, especially when it comes to recoverability and finding exactly what applications you want to recover. And then data loss from not backing up all components. That would be specifically talking about metadata. Those cloud native solutions out there and open source, which would include Valero, not only use the snapshotting mechanism to capture the data in your volumes themselves, but they also capture the metadata themselves of the application. So essentially those manifests, those YAML files of all of your services and secrets and different roles and everything. And oftentimes I will hear some people question, well, why would I need to capture my metadata? I have all of that stored in my repo or in Git or something, and they can easily just redeploy that metadata itself. Well, essentially, when it comes to having that metadata in a repo, when you do a restore, if you're restoring a stateful application, if you restore your data volumes with one tool, maybe a traditional tool or just snapshots, and then you restore your Git metadata from your repo itself after some sort of outage occurs, you're still going to have to manually stitch those two together. There's still going to have to be a process of making sure that that PV is connected to that metadata once it's all connected, once it's all deployed into a cluster. And so that's the benefit of having a cloud native solution that backs up both data and metadata. You hit that one click restore, and there's no other work you have to do on your end. The data and metadata are both going to be restored into the new environment or new namespace, whatever it might be. And automatically that application is going to be up and running again exactly as it was before, without any manual fixes that you'll have to worry about on your end. And so here, talking about how those cloud native solutions help you to increase your speed, really, of RTO itself. We've seen some studies where cloud native tools can help improve your RTO by 80%. And the biggest reasons because of that is restoring those applications faster. As I just talked about, that really gets down to data and metadata being backed up with that one solution and having a fully automated restore when you do go into that restore process. No stitching, no deploying of two different applications or from two different tools, one click and it's restored and up and running. When it comes to creating that disaster recovery plan, making that DR plan customized to exactly what you need is very important as well. Really getting very granular, I would say, is one of the key takeaways from here. Getting back to the fact that you don't need to be backing up everything necessarily, and so being selective of what you back up, but also being selective of what you restore. With Trilio, for example, if you do a backup, let's say, of an entire application, and you have a backup sitting in your target, whether it be NFS or S3 or Azure Blob, you have that backup of the entire application sitting on your external storage. If you want to restore it, you can actually do transforms with your disaster recovery plans so that it fits exactly what you need. So maybe I don't need to restore the entire application itself. I only need to restore a secret or a service. I can do that from my DR plan. Maybe I want to restore into an entirely different distribution. Maybe that application was first running on AWS and now it's running in Google, for example, or I want it to run in GCP. I can use a transform to change the metadata of that application before it's even restored and then automatically that application gets restored into GCP and properly runs in GCP despite two different infrastructures. So all of this can be customized with those DR plans. And then lastly, gains that agnostic piece, backing up any cloud, any storage, and any K8s distribution. So Trilio falls into this basket of being one of those tools that is completely cloud, storage, and distribution agnostic, as long as it is a certified CNCF Kubernetes distribution, and as long as the storage is using a CSI driver with snapshotting, then you can back up and restore amongst any of those clouds, storage, or distributions. So really just giving you that freedom to be able to be flexible across different clouds and avoid that vendor lock-in. So then moving into metric number 2, which is a good segue from what we just talked about with that agnostic piece. Migration speed, also very crucial when thinking about a data resiliency solution. And so why does this matter? It really gets into especially those wanting to have a multi-cloud environment, not wanting to put all of their eggs in one basket and not relying essentially on one cloud. So with a tool, with a backup and recovery tool, you want to make sure that you have that agnostic piece so you can have smooth migration. Again, this is a situation where it's just really one click when it comes to after that backup has been taken, one click to restore it into another environment or another cloud altogether. Traditional methods, even if you can find a way to migrate from one cluster to another, oftentimes it is taking up more resources. It takes more time to implement that traditional backup recovery method or tool into another cloud to have that migration occur. It could, again, lock you into a vendor if you're not able to do that migration properly itself. And it can also cause some security issues as well. Being dependent on one cloud, for example, if you have all your eggs in one basket, all of your technology, all of your applications on one cloud, if that cloud becomes compromised and you don't have a secondary location or a secondary cluster to migrate into, that can pose a security risk to you. So that, again, that's why we always think it's very, very important to be ready just in case, even if you're not a multi-cloud user, to be ready with a tool that you can immediately restore into another cloud, into another infrastructure, if the time comes that you need to do so. So here, migrating your entire applications faster with those cloud native applications. Here, a lot of what we just talked about here. So reducing that downtime to satisfy our customers, having that automatic metadata and data restore happening, taking advantage of those Kubernetes principles like eventual consistency to make sure that you're having as quick of a restore as possible while not eating up all the resources of your cluster itself. Meeting those SLAs with compliance, we talked a bit about upgrading your environments, also a big use case for migration itself. You want to make sure that if you're ever going to upgrade to a newer version or upgrade to a different distribution altogether, that you can smoothly do that restore. And with a cloud native solution like Trilio, you can do that. For choosing a storage or cloud agnostic platform to avoid vendor lock-in, here again, avoiding the lock-in itself of being reliant on one storage platform or the snapshots of that one storage platform can cause you to have lock-in. So you want to make sure you avoid that as well. Increasing your security by having a backup cloud or a secondary location is always key, as we just talked about here. And enjoying all the benefits, the test and dev benefits of being able to troubleshoot. That'd be a good example as well with that migration piece. Is you have an issue of an application itself, you can capture that application with whatever bugs might be occurring, test it exactly as it was with real data instead of fake data in your test or dev environment. And then once you find out the solution, you can fix in your production itself. That's a big use case for DevOps teams, especially, that they tend to like with Trilio, is being able to capture an actual application in production and move it to test to figure out what's actually going on. Now, metric number 3, disaster recovery speed. So here, talking about the speed of when a disaster actually occurs. So this we picture a little bit outside of RTO itself. that RTO is the goal and the minimal time you want to take in terms of doing a restore, at the minimal time that you want to take for any sort of downtime. Whereas disaster recovery speed, we're looking at that whole picture, the whole picture of how fast it takes you to be able to execute or recover from a cybersecurity attack or some other sort of downtime happening. So here's the real values of what you can actually achieve. Then think of RTO as the goal of what you want to achieve. And so minimizing that speed itself, being as fast as possible, or maximizing that speed itself. You want to think about this, we want to especially look into the consequences of a cybersecurity attack, because that is the most common disaster recovery situation. And so in order to avoid those cybersecurity attacks having a negative impact on your environment itself, you want to make sure that you have as comprehensive of a DR strategy as possible. So those disaster recovery plans we talked about before, being able to build them out ahead of time and then having a one-click restore to be able to restore as quickly as possible. The average downtime we found from some of our resources such as IDC and Gartner of a ransomware attack is 22 days. And then the average cost of downtime just to the average organization is $5,600 per minute. So if you do the math on that, that is hundreds of millions of dollars. It's over $100 million in loss, in costs, essentially, from having a downtime of 22 days. And so, of course, you want to make sure that you have the ability to restore in the event of a ransomware attack if this ever occurs. This is also why, for those ransomware attacks, the ransoms are expensive. They're a lot, but they're never as much as the cost of the downtime itself, because these malicious actors know that if they do something to corrupt data, and if it's more costly to you to just rebuild, then that's what you're going to do. So they purposefully would want to set then their ransoms lower to make sure that you pay that ransom instead of spending the time to rebuild your infrastructure. But luckily, if you have a cloud native tool, then you're able to rebuild that infrastructure much, much faster and end up not paying the ransom itself. So continuous backup and restore is a new feature that we have coming out soon for Trilio, I believe Q3 or Q4. By the end of the year, we're going to be having continuous backup and restore. And what this is essentially, you can think of it as high availability combined with a backup and restore technology. So as you take a backup of one application in your cluster 1, then it will automatically be restored to cluster 2. So as this cyclical process is occurring, you're constantly backing up, constantly updating and restoring between your two sites. So very similar to that HA technology, but now you also have a backup sitting in your NFS S3 or Azure Blob storage target as well. So you will still have that hard copy someplace else in case both clusters have an issue or you need to restore to a third cluster someplace else. And of course, when the restore does happen, you need to switch from site 1. Maybe site 1 becomes compromised. You need to switch over to site 2. Then, of course, having that continuous restore means that the majority of that application is already up and running on site 2. 99% of it is probably already there. So all it takes is one click switch to move your operations over to that site 2. Click-driven DR plans. This is with our UI itself. If you've ever gotten a chance to see a Trilio demo, we always go through the DR plans themselves and talk a bit about those transforms as well in terms of how to change the metadata of an application before it is even restored into that secondary environment. So again, just gets into the details of having that very, very granular and savable DR plan. Again, you want to make sure you're agnostic for in the event that you have to switch over to an entirely different cloud or distribution. And lastly, this multi-tenant agentless and self-service piece. This also helps with those speeds in terms of multi-tenant, meaning that you have multiple people that can go in and work on the DR plan itself. At the same time, it's not a one-person show. Agentless, meaning that there is no agent plugged into your cluster itself. Trilio only uses the resources it needs when it needs it in terms of executing a backup or restore. So agentless means that you're also going to have faster restore times because you're going to be more efficient with your resource use, essentially, instead of bogging down your cluster itself when doing a restore. And then lastly, self-service in the event of maybe a smaller disaster occurring in terms of a smaller team having issues with their application, they can have that self-service component where you can go in yourself and do your restore itself, or create your backup plan exactly as you need to without relying on another team to manage all of these things. If you do want to set up your organization to rely on a backup and recovery team, that's completely up to you. We just want to make sure that we have the flexibility to have this self-service in Trilio itself, and to obviously, of course, control the roles and permissions there. So individuals can go in and only see and can only interact with what they need to in terms of backing up and restoring their own applications. And now lastly, we have metric number 4, cost. Of course, it always comes down to cost. Here again, we have that same stat of the $5,600 per minute. So obviously it comes down to cost in terms of every minute counts when you're trying to restore an application from some sort of DR event that might have occurred. Here, 91% of organizations said that in just 1 hour of downtime, it cost them $300,000. So just a universal average out there. I'd be curious if anyone has done tests. You don't have to tell me yourself, but if you've done tests and if you know what the cost would be of your organization or your applications going down for 1 hour. And if not, a very important metric to be and make sure that you know, in order to make sure you're getting the most ROI out of whatever disaster recovery solution you decide to use. And then lastly, ransomware attacks, of course, what we've been talking quite a bit about because they're very prominent today. And the average cost of that ransomware attack is just over 300K. Again, essentially they're assuming that it's more expensive for you to rebuild, and so they want you to pay the ransom to get their data back, get your data back. By the way, most of the time you don't get all of your data back if you do even pay that ransom. And so this was in 2020, and that is a 171% increase from 2019. So even that stat is a bit outdated. In these new reports, it could even be higher in terms of the costs. Some of the hidden costs of legacy data protection, that more downtime means more expensive, as we just saw from that $5,600 per minute. Those manual processes take up more individuals, more time, and more resources, and it adds in more room for error, more room for human error if you have these manual processes or manual stitching of snapshots themselves. Whereas being automated with a cloud native solution, you don't have to worry about those human errors coming into place. Customer loss, if you have downtime, of course, is going to affect your bottom line. And then any ransomware protection is usually not included in those legacy data protections. It's also not included in open source solutions that are out there, at least today. And of course, the individual snapshot approach would depend on how you build your snapshot itself, but odds are it probably doesn't have as comprehensive of ransomware protection as an enterprise grade solution would have. When I'll stop here for a minute just to address this. When I'm talking about ransomware protection in your disaster recovery solution itself, this is referring to automatically being able to encrypt your backups through your tool and automatically being able to make your backups immutable through your disaster recovery tool. And so these are the two things you want to make sure you're looking for in whatever solution you end up deciding to go with. Build this one out. And so finally, slashing those costs and to increase your ROI with a cloud native solution. You avoid that vendor lock-in, which we all know can get costly if you end up getting stuck with one provider. You can have faster recovery, really is what it comes down to, based on these preset policies that you build out, and then just having to do a one-click restore when the time comes. Easy user interface gets back to that multi-tenancy and self-service. You don't have to have one specialist or one team responsible for all of the backups and restores. If you have an enterprise grade cloud native protection solution, you can have a management console in there as well. So you don't even need to know the basics of Kubernetes in order to do your backups and restores. Full application coverage in terms of data and metadata, we've talked about as being very, very important to capture both within the same solution. And then of course that built-in ransomware protection that the majority of those cloud native tools out there definitely have some sort of cloud ransomware protection. For us at Trilio, we have aligned to the NIST cybersecurity framework in terms of aligning how to make sure you're detected in the event of a possible ransomware attack through your backups themselves. We make sure that your backups are protected in terms of immutable and encrypted. And then, of course, lastly, that reliable restore process itself, making sure you have confidence in your DR tool to restore in the event of a ransomware attack. And so with that, I've gone through all 4 of those metrics I wanted to cover today. So I'm curious now, after hearing all of these, what does the audience think? Which ones were most important to you that we talked about today in terms of those 4 metrics? The RTO, the migration speed, especially if you're probably a multi-cloud user, that might matter a lot to you, disaster recovery speed, or the cost of the downtime itself. I'm seeing some questions in the chat as well. I'll go ahead and answer some of these as we get towards the end here. If I don't get to you, don't worry. We have a whole Q&A section we can go through. So where can I get more info on Trilio? That was from Wendy. And so you can go ahead and visit trilio.io for our website itself. Also, at the very end of these slides, you'll see 2 QR codes. One will be to sign up for a demo with one of our solutions architects. So it might be myself or someone else on our team. Or you can also sign up for that ebook itself once it gets released and learn more about Trilio, specifically as it pertains to what I've talked about today with these 4 metrics. Does it support SSO? Yes, it does. LDAP and the majority of OAuth providers, OIDC, that was it I'm looking for, OIDC providers out there you can integrate with. So if you want to have a Google single sign-on, GitHub single sign-on, whatever it might be, you can use that to log into Trilio easily. Okay, looks like our metrics are about done. I'm seeing a slowdown here. So we can go ahead and submit those and hit next. So it looks like, again, a bit of what I expected, which is good. RTO being one of the more important pieces out there, disaster recovery speed being very, very important out there, which makes a lot of sense. You know, when you're thinking about RTO and disaster recovery speed, they're very, very related. And so making sure that you're ready in the event of a disaster correlates with RTO, but is definitely its own beast at the same time. And the cost of downtime absolutely makes sense as well. When it all gets down to it, it gets down to that bottom line. For none, I'm curious, whoever entered the none on here, if none of them truly were important, or if there was another metric that you think of that you feel is more important than any of the 4 that we discussed here today. The application-centric piece, actually, we didn't quite get to today. The application-centric piece is referring to cloud-native solutions only backing up applications and their data and metadata. This really gets into that granular piece, actually, that I talked about. When you have some other solutions out there, especially traditional, they'll back up an entire VM. And in these instances, that's not necessary. You're essentially paying more storage costs than you need because all the infrastructure of that VM does not need to be backed up. What's really most important to you and your business is the application itself. And so that's why these cloud native tools such as Trilio take that application centric piece, also relating to the metadata and data of that application backed up in one go. Scalability, obviously very important. With enterprise grade solution, you're going to find that it's very, very scalable if your cluster itself grows or the number of clusters grow in your organization itself. The tool will grow along right with you. With some of those open source solutions, Valero specifically, we've heard some issues with scalability. Oftentimes we'll have individuals and organizations come to us because they feel they've grown too big for Valero and it is not providing everything that they need. And then snapshot-based protection, also, again, it's going to be difficult to scale. You're going to have to essentially rebuild your system every single time that you're bringing in new applications. Simple management, all of those enterprise-grade solutions have that management console. The others may or may not. And then easy restoration, as I mentioned many times, that one-click automated restore of your data and metadata without having to worry about stitching anything together or any manual processes in there. Here we go. And so now talking about Trilio specifically, um, this entire talk, we wanted to keep it high level and keep it general. But, obviously we'll talk here about Trilio specifically. And so these are all the factors that Trilio plays, all of the design pillars that we have and we focused on from day one. Agentless means that you take up less resources. Trilio spins up when it needs to do a backup or restore and then spins back down. So you're not going to be bogging down your cluster itself and having any sort of disruption. Getting into the non-disruptive part, that would be no freezing and thawing of your databases. Your applications can keep running as usual when you do backups themselves, because we do them in the background and are non-disruptive. Multi-cluster and multi-tenant, we talked a bit about. With that self-service UI and multi-tenant piece, you can manage multiple clusters and the backups of multiple clusters all within one pane of glass. It's scalable, infinitely scalable, really. As large as your cluster gets or as many clusters as you have, doesn't matter. You can keep using Trilio to back up those applications in those clusters. And then open universal backup schema. This is something that's very unique to Trilio. When we do a backup of an application, we're backing up that metadata in JSON format and data itself in K8s format. And K8s, if you're not familiar, is a Linux industry standard. And so this means that even though we are a proprietary tool and we're an enterprise paid tool and we're not an open source solution, we still make sure that our backup formats are open universal, because that way, if you want to maybe use another tool, maybe a malware scanner or something else to interact with those K8s files, you'll still be able to do that. You don't have to only use Trilio to interact with those K8s files after, of course, you've created them with Trilio. And then, of course, hybrid cloud infrastructure, public cloud, on-prem, as well, even air-gapped environments you can get Trilio onto to do backups and restores. And then here we just have some of our partners that we work with very, very closely. OpenShift, Rancher, Canonical, all we've worked with for a while now and have close partnerships with. Okay, so with that, we can go into a bit of Q&A. I can see some have come up here.
Yeah. So Ben, great stuff. And one thing I wanted to ask you about, you talked about so many wrinkles with backing up and restoring, Kubernetes and containers, and the plurality of responses on your first poll question was that people were using legacy backup solutions. And I really like that saying that if you're not testing your restores, you don't really have a backup solution. And given the stitching that you mentioned and things like that, it seems even more important to test restoring of container and Kubernetes-based applications and data, just because it can be unfamiliar and all that stuff. Do you run into a lot of potential customers who've had Kubernetes-based restores failing?
Occasionally, yes, because it's a newer technology, and people are getting used to what Kubernetes is, and so that it's the pros and cons. The thing about Kubernetes is it's the modular nature of it. The fact that you have all these containers and microservices makes it so efficient, so much better than monolithic applications, because you can take little pieces and move them to other applications, or you can be much more efficient with multiple applications using the same service, for example. But with this orchestration, it makes more complexity. It means that sometimes people will be restoring an application and not realize some microservice that they missed in their restore, or maybe the microservice was outdated when they did the restore itself, and then there was failure. So I completely agree with the statement that if you're not testing your DR solution, do you even really have a DR solution? And so to that point as well, with Trilio and with most of those cloud native applications or tools out there, you can do tests. You can easily do a test restore, and then at least with Trilio, you can do an automatic cleanup after that test has occurred. So in one sweep, you have the restore, see it worked, click on cleanup, and then that application gets removed. And so you can do a test later on down the line. But I like that statement. I totally agree.
And the tool sounds very cool on that in that regard. Hey, another quick question for me before we get into sort of all of these audience questions that have been rolling in too. You talked about the 4 metrics: RTO, migration speed, DR speed, cost of downtime. The audience picked DR speed, but I'm curious, which of those 4 metrics do you see as the most important?
Absolutely, yeah, great question. I do see RTO as the most important because it fits into each of the following three metrics. To me, RTO is your goal of what you want to make sure is the maximum time it takes to restore after downtime, right? And so that's at the core of each of those other three metrics, and that's at the core of what you want to make sure that you're improving, really. And so I think that that's a big advantage of cloud native solutions. You can ultimately improve that RTO, and if you improve the RTO, you also improve migration speed, you improve disaster recovery, and you improve costs as well for minimal downtime.
Huh. Okay. So it's like a virtuous circle. If you improve RTO, then
Exactly.
you're hitting all the other ones too. Cool. Great.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Hey, Imtiaz is asking, is the backup data encrypted?
Sure. So essentially, if you want it to be, yes, we have the option in Trilio to be able to encrypt your backup data in transit and then also at rest. This is for if you're using S3 buckets. And I believe also Azure Blob, you should be able to encrypt as well. So the answer is yes, you can choose to encrypt your backups. You also can choose not to encrypt your backups because encrypting a backup does inherently take up more storage. And so it can be more expensive. But if the data is critical enough, then you're going to want to make sure it's encrypted.
Okay, great. And while we go through some more questions, I'm just going to forward to the next slide just so people have an opportunity to grab that QR code if they're interested in doing that. Next question comes from Fred saying, we struggled with backup of elastic beanstalk environments. Can you suggest good strategies for handling infrastructure components that sit outside the container data?
Sure. So with a cloud native solution like Trilio that we've talked about, it is within the cluster itself. It's any data or metadata within that cluster itself. And so with a Beanstalk environment, I actually would recommend probably turning towards traditional data protection if it is outside of a cluster itself, just because this technology still obviously works very, very well. It's just not equipped as well with containerized cluster data. So for that one, I would say of the four we discussed today, a traditional enterprise solution would be your best bet.
Okay. All right, great. A question from Migaj who's asking, can selective backing up cause any serious data loss? In the example, updated file with same name and capacity, et cetera, et cetera.
Can selective backing up cause any serious data loss? Okay, I see a little bit of what you're saying here. So any confusion between the names of the files themselves or anything like that. So the way Kubernetes works is, I think I'm answering this correctly. If I'm not, go ahead and ask another question and correct me. But the way Kubernetes works is every single thing has a UID. Everything has a unique identifier. So even if there's a similar file name, it will have a different unique identifier. And so we've never really seen any issues with Trilio getting confused on backing up or restoring applications because of some similarity in names themselves, because of that UID itself. I will also say that when it comes to restoring with Trilio, for example, if I restored a service that is the exact same, if I restore it into a namespace and I basically duplicate a service, the service already exists there, and I, for some reason, want to restore the exact same service in that exact same namespace, it still will have a different UID once it's restored so that there's no confusion between those two services, if that makes sense. We basically made sure we designed it to not get confused when it comes to Kubernetes nomenclature. Let me know if I answered that question correctly or not. I was a little confused on the question itself.
Yeah, great. And Mikaj, also, if we don't get to it here, in this live portion, we will get that question over to Ben. And Ben, maybe you can follow up offline. Elias is asking, and so I guess I'll contextualize this a little bit. You've been talking about sort of the overarching problem set, and then you talked a little bit at the end about what Trilio does about it. And he's wondering a little bit more about, what are some of your competitive differentiators against, other companies that are offering, services in your space?
Sure, absolutely. Yep. So competitive differentiators, I think that the two biggest ones that always come to mind with Trilio is number one, that universal backup schema. A lot of the other competitors out there, actually, as I'm aware, all of the other competitors out there use a proprietary format when they
Mm.
back up your applications themselves. And so you can only use them to access any of those backup files. So it's a little bit of that lock-in feel, because it's proprietary, whereas Trilio is a universal schema, QCOW2, and so you're not locked in with Trilio. Secondly, I would say ransomware is a big one. We've really gone above and beyond in making sure we follow the NIST cybersecurity framework in all of our different capabilities for making sure that your backups are protected or alerting you if we detect some strange activity in your backups. And so essentially being able to alert if there's some sort of ransomware attack that might have occurred. And so we've really gone above and beyond in that regard as well. And then lastly, I would say the migration would be the third one that also comes to mind. We oftentimes get a lot of praise in terms of the ease of use of restoring an application from one distribution or one cloud into a different distribution or cloud. So that multi-cloud piece. We do this through the use of transforms. You can basically say an application in cluster one was using storage class one, let's say, do a backup of that application one. Now, once I have that backup and I want to do a restore down the line, I can go in to do the restore and say, hey, application, instead of using storage class one that was in cluster one, now use storage class two that was in cluster two. It's as simple as a few lines that you have to input into the UI itself, and then you kick it off and it'll automatically reconnect to the new storage class and be up and running. And so that third one I would say is that multi-cloud migration we usually get a lot of praise for.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for those points. Those are really helpful. Um, and we've probably got time for one more question here. And we've got a question coming in about ransomware. And what do you recommend for learning more about ransomware protection and recoverability? Especially in this Kubernetes context.
Absolutely. Yep. So we have some resources on Trilio.io in our blogs that we've talked about. Also, if you go to our YouTube page, Trilio's YouTube page, you can find a lot of recorded demos and webinars that either myself or someone else on our team has done. And there are some on there specifically geared towards ransomware itself. Beyond those two resources, I would also say if you want to sign up for a demo through that schedule a demo QR code you see on your screen right now, and if you specify that you'd like to learn more about ransomware, whoever talks to you on the SA side will happily go more into depth about ransomware, because we know this is an important topic, and it can be a whole conversation on its own. Ransomware can. So definitely encourage you to either look online, look on YouTube, or go ahead and mention that in scheduling a demo.
Okay, well, Ben, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much for this presentation. I think we could talk about this for a couple of hours, but unfortunately, we're up on time. Really appreciate
Yeah,
you coming on and giving us this update.
sounds great. Yeah, thank you, Scott. Thank you for having me on today, and it's always a pleasure.
Likewise. All right. And before we wrap up, we do have one more piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of our $300 Amazon gift card today is Michael Lopez from Idaho. So congratulations to Michael. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Trilio for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.